You might recognize the inspiration for the title of my remarks, Dr. Kilner's book, Why the Church Needs Bioethics. It's published more than 10 years ago. And my remarks are a tribute to the truth of that title and in honor of someone who has made and continues to make a deep contribution to biblical belief and practice in bioethics. I contacted John a few days ago to see how he's doing. As many of you know, Dr. Kilner has an incurable form of cancer. He's not able to be here this evening because his treatments have compromised his immune system and it's not safe for him to be out and about. But here's what John said, and I'll just quote. "This is a wonderful time of life, the freedom to craft a new balance between work and home life and to add a more overtly Christian and church-based dimension to the work. By God's grace, my health has been holding up well. The cancer is incurable, and the first of the two main forms of treatment only worked to hold it back for a year. But the second treatment continues to hold it back well for now, giving me a keen sense that God still has things for me to be and to do." John is keenly aware that death could arrive at any moment, and that God's restraining hand is keeping the waters piled up on each side, what he describes as his Red Sea experience. And even though he's retired, John is not sitting on the sidelines. He's working on developing a free online bioethics resource to help the average person make tough bioethical decisions. I'd say it's about 2.5 years too late, isn't it? We will welcome that when it comes online later this year. So here's the point I'm going to make this evening, is that the church and society's response to bioethical concerns raised by the pandemic illustrate the need for deeper moral and theological reflection on complex and contested issues for the sake of the church and the world around us. Now, a significant part of my remarks will be dedicated to pastors talking about bioethics in the church. And it's with gratitude for their leadership, their love for their flock, and the suffering that they have endured over the past 2.5 years. I will also be sharing what I learned in my doctoral research later in my remarks about clergy and end with where I see hope for the future. So this won't end on a downer note, even though we're going to talk a lot about a lot of down things. So I'm going to amend my thesis to include encouragement for the future. So the church and society's response to bioethical concerns raised by the pandemic illustrate the need for deeper moral and theological reflection on complex and contested issues for the sake of the church and the world around us. Pastors have the potential to lead their congregations with wisdom and courage. And let me just stop and say for you students, Dr. Sleesman has the slide deck. So don't worry if you don't capture things on the screen, because there are a lot of slides there. Some of them are a little bit text heavy, so don't sweat it, just take your notes. I just want to kind of alleviate the tension a little bit so you don't feel like you're losing the thread, because I'm going to be throwing a lot of things out there. So we're going to look at 5 different areas this evening. First, the twists on bioethical issues that have been triggered by the global pandemic. And secondly, a few other bioethical issues that may be relevant to the church. Anybody who's spent time in bioethics knows that we cannot cover all the issues in one presentation. I want to talk briefly about the cultural divide between society at large and the church. And when I say church, I'm really speaking of the evangelical church this evening. Pastors as competent moral leaders on bioethical issues, and then wrap up with healthy churches and hope. Well, about 6 years ago, my goodness, time flies, I interviewed 25 pastors, these were evangelical pastors, to learn how they developed confidence in leading their congregation on bioethical issues. And I will be sharing just a few highlights of that research toward the end of my remarks. Well, last month, I caught up with some of them to learn how they and their members were doing in light of the pandemic, and what issues they were experiencing, and whether the church still needs bioethics. So when I mention a pastor that I don't name, he is from this group. I'm selecting just a few bioethical issues to examine. I know you've already heard ethical reflections from Dr. Sleesman about engaging virtually for telemedicine, and from Dr. Joe Gibbs about technique taking over medicine. So it will come as no surprise to you that the pandemic has had an effect on Christians and the local church. And as the pandemic begins to subside and hospitalizations decline, and there are fewer serious cases of serious illness and death, we are finally just beginning to take a clearer look at the past 2+ years. Almost overnight, COVID has fallen off of the front page, and appropriately so. Some of our current arguments seem frankly insubstantial in comparison to the invasion of Ukraine and the daily death and destruction that we're witnessing through social media. It was 2 years ago, last Friday, during my first year as president of Taylor University, that we announced to the students that spring break was going to be extended. It was going to start earlier and end a little later so that we could have 2 weeks to flatten the curve. 1 week later, we told the students, by the way, you are not coming back. Some of them had taken all their stuff with them. Some of them had only taken their laptop. So there's a little interesting challenge in helping them get the things that they needed. But the reason to flatten the curve was to lessen the burden on national hospital capacity, particularly ICU capacity. You probably remember seeing the curves. Here's the curve. This is the total number of cases expected. You flatten it and your hospitals can handle it. Same number of cases, takes longer, but hospitals can handle it. Well, the challenges that were faced by university were played out in every church across the nation and every other institution. We all remember what it was like during the lockdown. Remember the lockdown? Seems like a long time ago. Well, due to the quarantine, we only told inside jokes. You all can count the jokes. If you come up with the same number I did, that means I succeeded. If you come up short, that means, wow, that really fell flat. I'm actually going to sprinkle these through there because this is kind of some heavy stuff. We need to be light in our hearts, even as we're dealing with some very serious things. The other thing is we had to remind ourselves to try our jeans on every few days to make sure they still fit. Because pajamas and yoga pants will have you believe that all is well in the kingdom. Well, 2 years later, we can begin a preliminary assessment of what just happened. I kind of feel that way, Jane, I feel that way about the presidency. What just happened? But I'm going to do it through a bioethical lens. And let me just pause and say, you saw the parentheses on my statement, that for this evening, I will be using bioethical and ethical interchangeably. So when I say ethics, I'm really thinking of the global pandemic has added new dimensions to more familiar issues, for example, vaccine safety and uptake, allocation of resources such as personal protective equipment. But I think it's important to stop and acknowledge that the challenges and disagreements we experienced were probably not just ethical ones or even primarily ethical ones, but they were political and personal and rarely theological. It also has revealed disconnects between what we say we believe and how we live it out in times of intense conflict and stress. How do we disagree agreeably about things that aren't core gospel matters? I'm sure all of you had an opportunity to do that in the last 2 years. Were you able to do it agreeably, or did temperatures rise a little bit and blood pressure go up a little bit? I think we all have kind of seen some things about ourselves that maybe were not as comforting as maybe could have been. How have we elevated political differences and personal choice above truly theological differences? And how did we treat others in the process of doing that? So a theme I want you to hear is values in conflict. What causes conflict and stress? Sometimes it's not because you don't know what to do, it's because you don't know how to choose between competing values. And we will see that particularly played out as I go through the tensions between public health and clinical practice, clinical medicine. So I want you to think about the values that you can identify as I describe situations. I may identify them sometimes and I may not, but to begin to wrestle with how do we negotiate when we have competing goods? And more specifically, what moral values related to bioethics can you identify? It's obvious that these conflicts have not been well resolved in the public square. Is the church navigating this in a better way? And if not, why not? And if we have, what can we learn and use for the peace and prosperity of the city, as Jeremiah reminds us in chapter 29. So let's look at a few of these issues, not to settle them, not to take sides, but to simply lay out the issues. First of all, public health. I'll bet a lot of people couldn't define public health 2 years ago. You kind of heard of it. You think maybe that's where you go get free vaccines, but beyond that, who knows what it is. So there are different ways to define it. This one is taken from the CDC in their training. They have a public health 101 module if you want to dig into it. It's defined by the CDC as the science and art of first preventing disease, second prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts and informed choices of society, organizations, public and private communities, and individuals. Sounds pretty comprehensive, doesn't it? It's like we want everybody to be better all the time in every dimension. But it's focused on society, it's focused on large groups. It's on maintaining and improving what sometimes is called group level health or population level health. So that's the cumulative health, the statistics. It's done through education, a lot of educating. How many people's Instagram feeds were populated with the first thing that pops up is wash your hands, wear your mask, all that. WHO got control of our Instagram feeds, and we were being educated about public health. That's a clear example of education. Policy making, probably where some of the most intense conflicts arose, because when you're making policy at a national level, all sizes do not fit, and one size does not fit all. At the state and local level, at Taylor, we had much better success. We enjoyed a very congenial and warm relationship with our state director of public health, as well as our county public health officer. They worked closely with us, and they were very appreciative of how hard Taylor leaned in to comply with public health guidelines, care for students well, and to have the best learning experience possible. So we ended up only being remote for the rest of the spring semester and returned to in-person classes in the fall. And we did have chapel in person from the beginning. And that was just a great joy to be able to gather together. First, very small, socially distanced groups, and then gradually we were able to add more to the live chapel. Public health also includes those who work on improving water, housing, and food. Public health professionals include community physicians, and I think community-based medicine is a wonderful branch of medicine to go into if you're going to become a doctor. They also include occupational physicians. I think we have an occupational therapist in waiting up there. Epidemiologists gather information and generate statistics about the incidence and causes of disease in the community. We had epidemiologists who were very busy during COVID, trying to figure out how many hospitalizations, how many ventilators are being used for this, how many ventilators are available for non-COVID cases, what are the trends? That's all examples of epidemiology. Most of us are more familiar with clinical medicine than we are with public health. Why? Because we've all been to the doctor, even when you're healthy. How many of you have had to have a school physical? That's an example of clinical medicine. So you were healthy, but you still had an interaction with the physician. This is the domain of the physician-patient relationship. The focus is on the diagnosis and treatment of a disease or an injury in the individual. The physician's responsibility is to the patient in front of him or her. Do you see the tension between what the physician is doing and what public health is trying to do? We have the individual versus group health. So there's a value in conflict at the kind of a very broad, non-granular level. The doctor's deciding what is best for that particular person, hopefully based on a relationship that extends beyond that first visit, that they've had a number of visits. And that's helped our family in having a long-term relationship with our family care doctor, because when she's about 3 years old, decided, as I believe in Women's Bible Study, that she was just not going to go, and she sat down, she popped her elbow out, this thing called nursemaid's elbow, finally went to the ER. Well, you show up at the ER with a child with something that's an abused arm. I'm so glad our doctor could say it was an accident. I know her daughter, I know her mother, this was not child abuse. That's why the physician-patient relationship is so important to have over long term when that's possible. Well, with COVID, we witnessed what happens when there's a conflict between decisions made to benefit the general public and the needs of the individual patient. For example, physicians who successfully used ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine to save patients' lives were later prohibited from prescribing, and pharmacists were prohibited from dispensing. Again, I'm not adjudicating whether that was right or wrong, but here's what I observed about it, is that doctors have always had the right to prescribe off-label uses of legal drugs. That's often how new treatments and new uses for the drugs are discovered. It is unprecedented to ban the prescribing and filling of a prescription of illegal medicine in this country. And these were for drugs that were safe and effective and have been used for decades and have volumes of research behind them. And only recently have these bans begun to be lifted. And I have to stop and say, I was struck by the contrast between pressures not to prescribe or not to fulfill a prescription and years of legal battles to force doctors to prescribe and pharmacists to dispense contraceptives which have an embryocidal effect. Now there's a case of not only values in conflict, but purposes in conflict, and why, it would be interesting to unpack the parallels there. Well, the conflict between public health goals and clinical practice has invaded the church as well. If a member of a local church was a doctor, they often became the unofficial public health officer. They decided for the congregation whether they were going to meet in person, there's a well-developed body of research and guidelines for how vaccines are developed and uptake. Many of these guidelines were altered during Operation Warp Speed to develop the COVID vaccines because of the global emergency. Traditional vaccine development takes typically around 15 to 20 years. That's why everybody said, you're not going to get a vaccine that fast. Nobody believed it could be done. There are rigorous protocols. It includes first testing on animals. First of all, to see, is there efficacy, and in the case of vaccine, is there an immune response? And then for safety before any human trials are started. Well, COVID vaccines were developed at lightning speed, and there's some reason behind why they were able to ramp it up so quickly, but I'm not going to go into that. It was less than 18 months from the first outbreak before vaccines were available. This was an unparalleled and worldwide cooperative effort. That's pretty remarkable. That's something to celebrate. There were animal trials conducted to assure that there was an immune response. Vaccines have to trigger an immune response so that your body will fight off the disease whenever it appears. Then there were parallel human and animal trials. This is what was different. And there were researchers and ethicists who raised questions about that, whether there should have been parallel trials or not. This bypassed the usual sequence. Well, while the speed from the laboratory to the market was astounding, it means that we didn't have the typical volume of evidence and the data about short-term adverse consequences. Have any of you heard of VAERS? It's the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, VAERS. And that's where physicians are to report whenever a patient gets a vaccine, if there's something that happens afterwards, they spike a fever, they get nausea, they throw up, whatever it is. Well, now we are beginning to accumulate some of those now that there's been uptake for a couple of years. Vaccines are also, the COVID vaccines are also new in one other way. And it's the first time that the vaccine does not introduce a piece of a virus or germ to trigger an immune response. Usually it's either a live virus or an inactivated virus. This vaccine uses mRNA, which is, what it does is it tricks the body into triggering an immune response to produce viral proteins that will then help it to resist a future exposure. But what we're seeing, and this report just came out in the last week, is that these vaccines, you have a first shot, second shot, booster, a second booster, and they're just talking about regular boosters, almost like the flu shot, which it may end up become wrapped into the flu shot, but it's doing it through a different mechanism. So we don't know how well this is going to work. We don't know about the impact on the next generation, like on your children. And particularly for females, this is always a concern with a new drug is, will it affect, how does it affect my reproductive capacity? You know, there was one, I just have to say, there was one recent adverse consequence that caught my attention because somebody was calling for more research on it, and that's tinnitus. My tinnitus has gotten so much worse since my vaccines and booster. It's like, could there be a connection? I don't know. Could also be age. But Christians who are considering these vaccines, some of them were asking questions about how were these developed and manufactured. So I did get calls about that. And that really made me happy because it said people are aware that vaccines can be produced unethically. So there are vaccines that were tested using a cell line that was derived from about 50 years ago that was believed to be from an aborted fetus. And that's just to see did it work. Several of the vaccines produce or manufacture the vaccine without using cell lines derived from fetal tissue, and there's one that does. So that was the ethical difference. But there are some who didn't even want to use a vaccine that had any remote connection with fetal tissue obtained from a induced abortion rather than a spontaneous abortion. That's somebody actually looking at the ethical issues from, I think, a strong moral foundation. I'm sure, how many of you experienced debates over vaccines in your own family? Anybody? Nobody? Yeah, some of us did. They got pretty intense. I have families who will not vaccinate, some because of waiting for safety, some because they don't think they need it. Those who didn't get vaccinated ended up pretty sick. One was in the hospital for 2 months. So some were more gracious about it, some were more militant about it. That's kind of the way society is. And these are all, believers, followers of Christ. In some cases, we disagreed agreeably, and in other cases, we just had to let it go. Well, I followed up with some of the pastors about how they and their congregation were experiencing the discussion over vaccines. And one pastor said, quote, "People are more guarded in their views. Because of the tension around it, they just shut down and quit discussing it." He also observed a generational divide. His younger members focus more on their freedom to choose. You don't have to raise your hand because I'm not going to out anybody, but think about, would you put yourself, you younger people, in that category of like, I don't need it, I'm healthy, I'm strong. This is, I've got a good immune system. And then the divide was then between those who are older and obviously more vulnerable, who said, I need this vaccine because they're concerned about preserving not only their health, but their very life. One pastor told me that a 97-year-old member mused about intentionally exposing himself to COVID as a way to be finished with life. There's a new one. He didn't act on it, but he thought about it. This is one I found the most disheartening, is one pastor said that nurses in his congregation were tired of being exposed to higher risks because of other people's personal decisions. They even kept their family away from church to avoid being with the unvaccinated who were seen as the enemy. One nurse kept her family home. And older members, where church had gone online, as they all did, they were weighing the option of continuing online from the comfort and safety of their home versus going to church and being with the unvaccinated. Many of them have chosen to stay at home. So that's another way that this has divided churches, is it's physically divided them. I've already mentioned how it affects clinical ethics and patient care in terms of limited resources. I want to share one. By the way, COVID really has had an effect on family relationships. Did you notice that it was, our parents who were sneaking out of the house and the kids who were yelling at them to stay home? Well, in addition to rationing of care, that separation from a loved one can be very, very distressing. So I wanted to tell you just briefly a good news story. A friend of mine, Lisa Schinnebarger, is an engineer down in Georgia, and her parents, deeply in love for more than 61 years. Her mother was developing dementia. She was in a memory care home. When COVID hit, her husband had not been able to see her for months after not being separated for one day of their married life together. So she put her engineering to work and designed safe hug windows. And I think that's her father, George Glass, is on the left. That's the commercial picture. And on the right is George and his wife, Jan. So he was able to come every day and give her hugs. And you can see the smile on her face he couldn't physically touch her, but she had the feeling of his hands grasping hers and to see him close up and personal. So even in the midst of challenges, God has given us creativity to come up with solutions that are human and humane and say, we will not be defeated by this. Neither will we, rail against the night. A sadder part is what has happened to healthcare workers during COVID. And I've learned this from talking to different nurses and doctors in hospitals and out. 20% of healthcare workers resigned during COVID, and that number is going up. 92% of critical care nurses are quitting their career earlier than they planned. 92%. They have growing workloads. They have a real sense of betrayal. They feel that they've been betrayed by employers who wouldn't protect them. They could get PPE in the early months when the virus was so contagious and so deadly, having to reuse their PPE or buy their own, and they knew it was inadequate. By lawmakers who worked against public health measures, by the public. They also felt that they betrayed themselves because they couldn't care for their patients, they couldn't care for their colleagues. And nurses go into nursing because they care. They have growing workloads because colleagues have left. Many left to become traveling nurses who could make 3 to 5 times as much as a hospital employed nurse. Some of them experienced increasing abuse and threats. They were told to change out of your scrubs before you leave the hospital so you're not attacked in the parking lot. What have we come to that we are attacking our healthcare workers? Physicians experience the same thing. The Physicians Foundation's 2021 survey of America's physicians looked at COVID's impact on physicians and their patients. 70% of female and 60% of male physicians reported burnout, especially those in primary care or hospital-based. 14% sought mental health services. 20% knew of someone who had either attempted or completed suicide. And half of them reported a loss of income, which can add a real stress, especially to a doctor who's paying off enormous medical school bills. These nurses and doctors are in the local church, and their pastors are concerned about them. And one pastor told me about the disheartening changes he noticed in the nurses in his congregation. They're burned out. They're worried about how treatments are prioritized and allocated based on factors other than medical need. Tired of caring for seriously ill patients with COVID who refuse to get vaccinated. And they're tired of caring for seriously ill older adults for whom they have no treatment. What can we do? They're tired of watching people die every day. And they're asking, why do we let so many people suffer? And you can see how this exhaustion can lead to considering maybe mercy killing is the most merciful thing to do. Values in conflict because of very high stress and very low resources. I'm talking about emotional and physical resources. One dimension of this is moral distress. You find this language more in the literature on nursing, but moral distress occurs when you witness something or something that violates your morals and expectations. Either you witness it or you're unable to prevent it from happening. So you feel like you're complicit in it. A nurse can be troubled because she says, this is not in line with my moral compass, and this is at a time when it matters most. That's moral distress. And that can contribute to psychological distress. One study of nurses during the pandemic showed that 15% had suicidal thoughts in the previous month alone. Well, the church can help with resolving moral distress and burdens on mental health. The question is, are we equipped, ready, and attentive? This isn't the responsibility of only the pastor. And in rationing, tell me, how are we going to respond to another round of toilet paper rationing? Can you read that? Toilet paper, $39.99, and the 1 carat diamond ring is free if you buy the toilet paper. Pastors also have experienced burnout. Peter Chin, who's been a pastor for 20 years, wrote about the stresses of the past few years: presidential elections, racial unrest, and then, as if that weren't enough, COVID came. In his essay, "I've Reached My Breaking Point," Chin writes, "Never before had I considered health protocols in the context of the church." It's like, we're not a hospital. Why are we doing these health protocols? But today, being too strict with health guidelines might damage the well-being of the church. Does that sound like a public health type value? While being too lax might take the life of a congregant, a physician-patient type value in conflict. And he continues, all of this has injected a paralyzing degree of complexity and controversy into every single situation I face, every decision I make. And to make things worse, it feels as if everyone is on a hair trigger, ready to walk away at the merest hint that the church does not line up with their political or personal perspectives. Notice he didn't say moral or theological, political or personal perspectives. Does anyone know someone in their church who left over the masking guidelines of their church? Yeah, is that a reason to leave a congregation, I ask you? Meanwhile, the rate of pastoral burnout is increasing. A Barna survey last November revealed that 38% of pastors have considered leaving full-time ministry. That's 9 points higher than it was in January of last year. So in a 10-month period, we have a 9-point increase, 9% increase. You know, the whole world is living through COVID stress. And when we were in shutdown, lockdown, whatever you want to call it, it affected our mental health in obvious ways and some subtle ways. You know, I was stuck at home watching my dog chasing his tail around and around. I thought, wow, dogs are pretty easily amused. And I realized I'm watching my dog chase his tail around and around. All right, now for the heavy stuff, as if that wasn't enough. Bioethics has moved into the church. Let's talk about substance abuse of legal substances and opioid addiction. Because addiction, as you all know, can follow from legally prescribed painkillers, and the most notorious opioid is oxycodone. You've heard of Percocet and Percodan, but probably most infamously OxyContin because of their heavy-handed sales tactics. Did you know that addiction can begin in as little as 5 days of use? I did not know that. 5 days after surgery, you better be off your heavy-duty opioids. Women are more likely than men to have chronic pain and more likely to be prescribed opioids in higher doses for longer periods of time. So women, beware. And when the legal prescription runs out, you know that desperate patients who now are addicted to a highly addictive drug will turn to illegal sources to meet that craving need. Well, now we have the additional problem of many of these pills are laced with fentanyl. Fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine. And there's yet a newer drug that's about 10,000 times more potent than morphine. Sounds like a deadly drug, but it's always laced with something else. So you get this combination of 2, 3, and 4 different drugs. One of the reasons that fentanyl is exploding is because, talk about unintended consequences, with the widespread legalization of marijuana, Mexican drug cartels have turned to something more efficient. They don't have to pay farmers to grow marijuana crops and worry that the fields are going to be burned. They just have labs to make meth and fentanyl. And it's highly addictive. And I'm thinking, yeah, but you're killing your consumer in the process. So I think they just hope to keep expanding it until the entire North American continent is addicted. We've also seen an increase in opioid and overdose deaths due to COVID. It's understandable the factors that contribute to staying out of addiction or staying clean, that COVID reversed, the shutdowns reversed. Mandatory isolation. That's not what you need when you're trying to stay a recovered drug addict. No access to psychiatrists, or at best, Dr. Susan, some version of telemed that's really inadequate. They can't get into support centers. But they could have access to cheap and legal drugs. During a 1-year period from May 2020 to April 21, 100,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. Okay, you say that's not me. Well, let's talk about marijuana. Teens can access marijuana in gummy bears. You know, now that it's widely legalized, it's widely accessible. You know, in Illinois, you can't buy marijuana if you're under 21. But 30% of high school seniors reported that last year they had ingested cannabis. So something's happening somewhere to give them access to these gummy bears. Now, when they're at home under parental supervision, that number dropped because parents are home and it's a little harder to sneak around when you're stuck in the house with mom and dad all day. Let me tell you something about gummy bears. Eating candy is more dangerous than inhaling. So smoking a joint is actually safer than eating a gummy bear when it comes to cannabis. It may have a higher dose than the approved 5 milligrams. It could be 10 times that high. Eating it increases its psychoactive properties. Well, that sounds pretty exciting. Yeah, the high lasts longer, but you may not get an immediate high, so the students eat more. Indiana took 3 students to the ER last week because of cannabis overdosing. When the student panics because they're now on a high that was way more intense than they expected, then the school is having to call doctors, parents, ambulances to deal with the problem. And the risks are higher for teens because guess what? Their brains are still developing. So marijuana use can affect this, memory. We already know teenagers have a hard time remembering. Let's not make it worse. Processing of emotions. We already know teenagers are emotionally somewhat volatile. Let's not make it worse. Motor coordination. Well, I don't know about the motor coordination, but perception of time to go to bed. How much time have you been on that device? Are you done with Fortnite? Well, no, I guess it's now Dungeons and Dragons. That's a big thing again. I had no idea. So as you listen to this, what are the values in conflict that you observe? Just let you think about that. Let's talk briefly about some beginning of life issues. We'll go through these a little more quickly. The screening and testing of pregnant women. Pregnant women are offered or even pressured to undergo prenatal screening or testing. This is for the purpose of learning how to best care for your child if there is a problem. No, it's for learning in time to make a decision about termination of the pregnancy. Well, you say we would never do that because we love our children with Down syndrome. These children are at risk, not only in Finland and places where you hear that the incidence is about 0, but in the United States as well. I could not find any surveillance on the incidence of Down syndrome births since 2015. I think they've wanted to stop tracking because it's dropped so much. And Down syndrome support organizations are worried that the research funding is going to dry up because the people are disappearing, not because they're getting better treatments and care, but because the people themselves are disappearing, and that there may not even be enough of a population of children to do a study on if there are ways that their cognitive functioning can be improved. Would we do that? No, we wouldn't do that. Cleft palate, a very easily reparable birth defect. Babies with cleft palate are also disappearing. Gene editing is not yet available in the United States. So this would be a good time to do reflection and teaching and being prepared before the conflict or stress arises. And that's one of the things I want you to remember is it's best to be prepared and think about it before. And that's what all you students in the program are having the opportunity to do again and again. So for Christians, to what extent is it permissible to go to have a healthy child? Obviously, the mom will do all sorts of things like give up coffee and drinking and smoking and any drug except maybe a baby aspirin for the sake of having a healthy child. Are there limits on the steps that we can go to as Christians? And here's an active debate between two names that you will recognize, I hope, if you're in the program, Russell D. Silvestro and Callum McKellar, on the difference between gene editing the egg or sperm. So no conception has happened, so you're not gene editing a real, actual person, but a potential to become a person, and gene editing of the embryo itself. Now, no one argues for the gene editing of the embryo, but there is a difference of opinion among Christian scholars about the editing of the egg or the sperm. I think that'd be a very interesting debate to engage in and get informed about. Well, we do have a case of twins. I think there's one more gene edited babies born in China, and there's been a complete blackout on any information regarding these children. Well, what if something went wrong and that another gene segment was damaged in that child? Because that child is now an experiment that needs to be tracked for the rest of his or her life. Should that child be prevented from having more children and passing along the risk? If so, why? And if not, why not? Should a parent who is a carrier of a gene who refuses to have prenatal testing be prevented from having children? If so, why or why not? And this raises questions that should be asked of all reproductive technologies. Does this action exercise power or control over a future child? Who holds the power? Are there any risks to the child? We're not going to talk about IVF, but IVF does present increased risks to the child. Does this turn procreation into a project and a child into a product? Does this make the parents less willing to receive and accept a child who is born less than perfect? What if something goes wrong? In other words, what are the boundaries we will not cross in order to get a healthy baby? Pastors have been caring for couples with infertility. This is one of those situations where when the pastor comes in, it's usually in terms of pastoral care for a couple who is coming to terms with infertility, maybe with failed treatments, failed attempts, and there's a great deal of anxiety around that. But IVF and vitro fertilization is mainstreamed into the church. There are ethical ways that it could be considered, but the question is, are couples actually aware of this before they go down that path? This is where it's better to be prepared. And the best place to do it is in premarital counseling, not marriage counseling, premarital counseling. That's something the couple really needs to understand pretty well, because statistically, one person to one and one, if you're all of childbearing age, is not going to be able to have children. So it will probably affect some people in this room. It's better to be prepared when you don't know, it's a low stress situation, and you can really dig into the ethical issues and get that grounding and that shaping before you have to face the actual challenge. Commercial surrogacy. It's in the headlines right now because there are a lot of babies that have been born in Ukraine, a lot more on the way in the next few weeks, who are the result of commercial surrogacy. Next to the United States, Ukraine is number 2 in the world for commercial surrogacy. We hold the pride of being number 1. They do it in Ukraine because it's cheaper. It's 50 to 60,000 versus 100 to 150,000 in the United States. So as Russia is invading Ukraine, these parents are saying they're trying to demand that the pregnant woman who's due to deliver get out of the country so that they can have their baby safely. The problem is it's not legal anywhere else, so that baby would not belong to those parents. That baby would have to be raised by the surrogate mother. If she stays in Ukraine, then there's a risk she's not going to have a safe place to give birth. And they have found an underground bunker, and I think it's now up to about 80 babies. I don't know how many of those are surrogate babies, but a lot more are coming. By demanding that she leave or get to a safe place, she's having to abandon her husband and children in a time of war. Did we anticipate this when we walked down the path of commercial surrogacy? I don't think so, but it has actually entered the church. This article from Christianity Today, now it's about almost 4 years old, talks about women who have become surrogates for other women who are unable to carry children. Is this something that we should celebrate? The gift of life. What's not to celebrate about giving the gift of a child to another couple who are unable to carry one to term on their own? Interesting conversations. Does the church still need bioethics? This pastor, I'm not going to name him, he says, yes, COVID has shown us we don't have an ethical basis to start with. When I interviewed him for my research, found out that their church had an unusual number of sets of twins because of IVF. He had a couple who came to him and told him that their baby was coming soon, and he knew that they were infertile and she didn't look pregnant because they're having a baby with a surrogate. And so what's the pastor to do now? I mean, this baby is a real person. They're on the way. You're going to welcome them. And this has happened again and again, where pastors are like completely excluded from these decisions, and the moral teaching is either avoided or absent. So surrogacy isn't just an issue that's out there and we can look down our noses at other people. That's not all the right attitude. It is something that is in the church, probably more quietly and silently than not. Does the church still need bioethics? Yes, it does. The church, if it would be willing to think beyond its political bumper sticker responses, which we've had our fill of, is likely to be the only voice that can mix compassion with the value of life and the necessary sacrifices to preserve it. Do you hear that? The compassion makes compassion with the value of life and the necessary sacrifices to preserve it. We'd like life without the sacrifice, wouldn't we? So yes, the church needs bioethics to guide its responses, but the culture needs for the church to speak prophetically. Greg Strand, in his blog, Strands of Thought, he is the director of theology and credentialing for the Evangelical Free Church. He writes that although there was a time when the mores of the church and the culture were similar, that's no longer the case. Instead, he warns, quote, the culture continues to catechize the church, the people of God. You know what catechizing is? You know what catechesis is? It's basically teaching and forming the church to learn the ways of the world. And how do we know that's true? Because most of our deepest divisions haven't been over moral and theological issues, which culture doesn't care so much about, but political commitments and personal preference. In fact, I had a very heated admonishment of a family member who told me about how they were so rude to a store clerk because in Illinois we have to wear masks, who was wearing a mask and asked this person to put on a mask. Well, they're from another state, we don't wear masks. And instead of just putting on the mask, created a scene. And then we're calling this person, you're such an idiot. And I'm thinking, how can you do this? This is someone made in the image of God. She probably just has to do this because their employer has to follow the guidelines. And how can you disrespect another person over something so trivial as a mask? It might seem trivial to you, but it might be very, very important to that person. So it's how do we disagree and how do we treat others with whom we disagree deeply? Yes, the church still needs bioethics, but we need to get it right first. Here's why the church still needs bioethics. Guess what? People still get born. They still die. They go see the doctor along the way. So they're going to need bioethics because, believe it or not, you're going to make at least one bioethical decision in your lifetime. When that comes, you don't know necessarily when that will be, and it's usually accompanied by high emotional distress. There may not be moral distress if you don't know that there's a moral issue until afterwards and you realize, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But that's a terrible time to begin thinking deeply and theologically about it. So you all who are thinking about this, you were here this evening, you have a terrific opportunity to be prepared and to help the church think deeply about bioethics. And go to this quote from Dr. Kilner. The ethical challenges are getting more difficult and we would do well to prepare in advance. Here's what Dr. Kilner says about that. Yes, the church and the world still need far more bioethics than they know. The church in particular is well situated both as a theological institution that has so much to say about life and health, and as a grassroots institution that is so well positioned to reach people, families, communities, and larger entities in times of bioethical crisis. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about my research. I know we're up against the hour here. No, it's only 7 o'clock. I've got another hour. And this is how pastors become confident moral leaders on bioethical issues. So when you design study for your dissertation, you have to have a purpose statement. So here's the purpose of my study: to discover what factors contributed to pastors becoming bioethically confident leaders of their congregation. So I interviewed a sample of 25 pastors. These were all men. The only women who could have been candidates were in chaplaincy or had not had congregational experience. So I will refer to these pastors as he, because they were all male, from 13 states, predominantly the Midwest, but not exclusively. I had some on the East Coast and in the South. 7 denominations, seminary education represented there, ministry experience from 6 to 40 years, and they all perceived some level of confidence in dealing with bioethical issues. So I examined 3 questions. One was about their time in seminary. What influenced them during seminary, if anything, to think about these issues? Second, what they were experiencing in their congregation, either issues they had faced, because sometimes it was a personal issue, or issues that their congregation had faced. And then third, how did they develop confidence to become moral leaders in the congregation? Because we need pastors with confidence. If the pastor doesn't have confidence, then the congregation, the flock, is going to feel somewhat anxious about the counsel that they're giving, and they'll eventually go somewhere else. So here's what I learned about these remarkable men. First of all, they care very deeply about their congregations and they want to help. All of them pray. They pray in the counseling session. They pray as they prepare. When they don't know what to do, they pray. They value relationships. They display empathy, not judgment. They pursue continuing education. Yay for continuing education in all sorts of forms and varieties. They are diverse learners, and there are a lot of different ways to continue your education. And this is the most wonderful trait. They exhibit epistemic humility. So here's your big, $2 word. Used to be a 50-cent word. With inflation, it's a $2 word. Your epistemic humility is being humble about what you know and what you don't know. In other words, they know what they don't know, but they also know where to go for answers. We all would do well to exhibit epistemic humility. Even what we think we know about COVID, what we know about vaccines, what we know about safety, whatever it is, we need to hold that with some humility, because you know what, we might be wrong. Science is always changing and advancing, and we just might be wrong. These men are well equipped to preach, teach, and counsel in their congregations. Those 3 roles were very, very important. Each one is expressed differently in how they address bioethics. And here is a key factor in whether a pastor can be a strong moral leader of his congregation, and that is, do they trust him? There has to be a high level of trust, and trust comes when there is observable integrity and competence. They must be perceived as competent. So pastors need continuing education, and they need to have a basic grounding on bioethical issues, or they will not be perceived as competent. Also, consistency and reliability. And also a sense of humor. This pastor was out for dinner. The waiter says, sorry about the wait. The chef is working from home. A sense of humor always helps in a stressful setting. And how can a pastor develop competence? Well, ta-da, we have our very own CBHD resource, the Intersections Forum, which is on everydaybioethics.org. And let me just stop for a minute and say, I've heard from Dr. Epineth that soon there is going to be a one-stop landing place where you can get all the resources. So this will be brought in and that's going to be rolled out, let's just say the next 60 days, if all goes well. And if it comes sooner, then we will under-promise and over-deliver. But in one of these Intersections forum post by Jeremiah Wilson, he writes that part of the mission of CBHD, especially through Intersections, is to encourage more pastors to become pastor bioethicists. You're familiar with pastor theologians. Well, now this is another dimension of that, pastor bioethicists. I'm still quoting Wilson. All pastors are inevitably bioethicists, albeit in a more practical fashion compared to the professional bioethicists. And a common method that Christians have for answering about bioethical questions is let's find a Bible verse on that. So can somebody please find me the Bible verse on whether to get vaccinated or not? There's that thing about tattoos or not marking the skin, maybe that's it. Is a vaccine a tattoo? No, it's not going to help you. So he draws on the work of Kevin Van Hooser and David Van Drunen and argues for a broader approach. In other words, let's not look for rules. What is the rule about this, the rule about that? But let's look at the formation of the person to cultivate virtue and good character, to have a fully developed Christian identity that helps people to make wise decisions about complicated moral questions for which we do not have obvious and clear biblical rules. And essays by Wilson Van Drunen both are on the Intersections blog. Well, that's advice that's good not only for pastors, but for all of us. Shouldn't we be growing in virtue and good character and have a fully developed Christian identity? Here's an example of one. A pastor told me about his mother and her journey through memory care facilities. When she was clear-minded throughout her life, she cared deeply for family and friends. Her character was formed. And when her mind failed her, she continued to tour the halls, telling people that she loved them and they all loved her. Even when her mind failed her, her character was formed and she lived out of her character. That's the kind of Christian that we should all want to be. So I was interested in learning what would give them confidence. And top of the list, it's a very thick picture of lifelong learning, but top of the list, of course, is theological and biblical understanding. At the top of the list, these pastors are grounded in the word. They know how to handle the word well, but also knowledge of other disciplines. Dr. Sleesman has made an excellent argument on why medicine, science, and technology ultimately matter more to the church than bioethics proper. Those are very important disciplines to understand. The experiences that they have, but not just having the experience, but reflective learning, reflecting back on the experience. Sometimes the only time you do that is when it's a class assignment, and that's a great assignment to have. If you have an internship where you have to journal and reflect on what you're doing, that is a wonderful and rich kind of learning and reinforcement. Continuing education, continuing to refine their identity as a pastor. My own brother, who was a pastor and left the pastorate, later said he realized, and it was a long grieving process for him, he said, I realized that my identity was in being a pastor. And I loved it when people came up to me as their pastor. And that refining of identity happened for him in a different direction. But if your identity is in your role or your talents or your skills, that needs some refining. They did ethical reflection, they had counseling skills, and they had other factors that they knew that they could draw on in these situations. All this adds up to what we might call phronesis or practical wisdom, knowing what to do in the moment. What is the wise thing to do? A great preaching resource is John McClure's Ethical Approaches to Preaching. He says people know, they want to know how their faith affects what they do, and that's what they listen for when their pastor is preaching. In fact, a 2020 Pew Research Center study showed that 2/3 of Americans, 2/3, this is remarkable to me because we didn't hear it in our church, 2/3 of Americans heard at least one political reference or explicitly political sermon leading up to the November 2020 election. Well, I hope they heard more messages about their identity in Christ and their moral character formation, because moral character formation takes courage. It means holding to your moral values even in the face of adversity or at personal risk, declining to act unethically. C.S. Lewis talked about courage as, quote, not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at its testing point, which means at the point of highest reality. And this was echoed more recently by N.T. Wright, who observed that, quote, virtue is what happens when wise and courageous choices have become second nature. You don't have to think, what is the wise thing to do, the courageous thing to do? It's what you are prompted to do. As it develops, it becomes more of a disposition than a decision. One pastor said that I talked to just recently, pastors are called to exemplify to their congregation a holy moral life according to God's word. We're very public in that way. It might include being transparent about one's own struggles and helping others avoid pitfalls. The good news is that members tend to trust their pastor. Most adults who attend religious services regularly would trust their leader's advice on the vaccine, 61%. They trust their pastor more than state or local elected officials, more than the news media. You know, the only person they trust more than their doctor on advice on vaccines, more than their pastor on vaccines is their doctor, their primary care physician. But a slight majority haven't heard any advice either way. And evangelical pastors have the lowest rate of encouragement, 21%, and the highest rate of silence about vaccines, 73%. Why do people not go to their pastor? Pastors say, I wish the members would come to me sooner before an unethical decision is made that would cause regret. One big reason is awareness and avoidance. They might be aware that there's a moral issue and they don't want to hear what the pastor might say because they're not going to like it. They want the pastor to tap them and say, this is okay, you're going to be fine. And that may not be, may know that that's not what they're going to get. When pastors are unsure, they know how to get help. They know where to go for resources. It could be a former professor, say maybe a TEDS professor or a Trinity professor. It might be a Dr. Sleesman or Dr. Epinet. It might be another pastor, a former colleague, a textbook, a book, or online resources. Pastors are fluent in preaching, teaching, and counseling. Although if you're a pastor and listening to this at some point, let me just say, don't get discouraged. You know, as I was finishing my final edits to my dissertation, a pastor of a small church in rural Oklahoma called me, and I'll just call him Frank. Frank was a trained pastoral counselor who had done clinical pastoral training at a transplant hospital. He called because he was frustrated over how to help his congregation overcome apathy, misinformation, and mistrust about bioethical issues. And here's what Frank said to me, quote, they look at me like a horse looking over a fence. So don't get discouraged. It may take more than one time. There are some wonderful questions for the counseling role. We're going to kind of pass by those to get to the signs of a healthy church. I'm showing you this one because this is my home church. Now this is Christmas. So we are filling every seat. Not quite that full every Sunday, but we have done well through COVID. The signs of a healthy church. I'm going to draw on the work here of a man named Tom Rayner. He works in church coaching and assessment. He worked with Lifeway Resources, so he's good at researching churches and how they're healthy. And I'm just going to close with these 12 indicators that he found of healthy churches that made it during the pandemic. And my guess is if your church exhibited 6 or more of these, you probably did okay. So first, faithfully preaching and teaching the Bible. And that is number one, keeping people grounded. Jay and I are very blessed to enjoy that, whether online or in person, that never wavered during COVID. Secondly, they've increased their evangelistic efforts as a core priority. Third, healthy churches are providing hope and encouragement during the pandemic, not just wringing their hands and railing against whatever came down the pike that week. Pastors are reminding their members again and again that God has not abandoned you. He is working for your good. They are staying away from political fighting. And when the pastor stays away, the church members follow the lead and they stay off even of debates on social media. Pastor can be a courageous moral leader in that way, living it out with integrity and transparency. Some churches are reevaluating their staffing structure. They're open to massive realignments, even when they don't have clarity about what those might be. Pastors generally universally agree that we're going to be doing church differently. It's not going to be the same as it was in 2019. This is a really cool one. They seek to adopt foster churches. They're actively helping other churches, particularly those that are weaker and struggling. 7, they're redoubling their efforts on welcome ministries to have warm greetings as people are coming back. You want more than ever for them to feel like it's safe to come in. We want you here if they're visiting. this is a safe and warm and welcoming place. They're giving more attention to groups and small group structure, that these are so important to the health of the church. Number 9, this one surprised me. They're actually raising the bar of expectations. Rather than accommodating low commitment levels, they're raising the bar. So it's not saying, oh, we're just gonna make it easy for you to do all your activities online at home in your jammies. You know, because we know you're never gonna fit into those jeans again. 10, they're being friends to their communities, and they're showing the love of Christ, whether or not the community is friendly to Christian values. They're serving regardless, not because. 11, they're creating mini prayer groups, not large prayer gatherings, because, quote, mighty prayer can come from a small number. And there's something that happens in a small prayer group that can't happen in a large prayer setting. And 12, they are persistent. The leaders don't give up. They may not understand what is taking place, but they know that God has it under control. And I'll close with this example of a healthy church that really lived out number 10, being friends to their communities. This is a church that Jay and I attended for a number of years in Central Illinois. They expanded their outreach into the local hospital and worked out an arrangement where they provide for free all the chaplaincy services. So they had professional and trained lay chaplains. Well, guess what that meant during COVID? When mom and dad or daughter or son could not get into the hospital room, those chaplains were there every day, praying with every patient, and they prayed with over 48,000 patients during that time. Because they were already connected to their community, this wasn't their first outreach. They have a reputation of being a church that does community outreach. And the hospital welcomed them. They also provide chaplaincy at the community healthcare clinic. So this is how a church can live out what they believe in ways that they didn't anticipate when they started this program. They didn't anticipate what this would mean for families who had no one else to be with them, to have someone to come and pray for them with the love of Jesus. So in conclusion, does the church still need bioethics? Well, I just went past those signs. I thought that was up here. Somebody should have said, hey, where are the signs? Well, you students are going to get it later. Does the church still need bioethics? Yes, there's a generational divide, and the moral compass of the younger generation is being shaped in a completely opposite direction by schools, social media, and music, movies, and entertainment. They are insidiously at work to, quote, normalize sin. And then finally, going back to Greg Strand one more time. Absolutely, I love Greg. He's so enthusiastic about bioethics. The question is not if, but when we need bioethics training. We need the moral formation of both ethics, broadly speaking, and bioethics. Okay, he separated the two. He's being very precise here as a scholar. And we need to be willing to be disdained, if not outright despised. So, does the church still need bioethics? Yes, it's going to be more costly. It's going to require moral courage. But when you are filled with the leading of the Holy Spirit and being courageous and wise comes out of you instead of a checklist that you go through, there is no greater joy than having those kinds of interactions, those kinds of opportunities. So for you as a member of a church, and if any of you are here may have some area of church leadership in the future, just cling to that. Be persistent, grow in wisdom, and keep growing in your learning. The love and knowledge of God and this great world that He has made.